Hello and welcome, my lovely Year 13s, to your session on biological therapies for schizophrenia. Spec link, we're looking at drug therapy and we're looking at typical and atypical drugs. So pause here, give yourself your heading. Remember to write down the spec link. You know I like to give you the spec link because the spec link allows us to identify any specific questions that they may want to ask. So they may ask general questions about biological therapies and talking about drug, and you get a choice what you want to talk about, or they may specifically ask, for example, identify one atypical drug and explain its role in treating schizophrenia for 4 marks. So yes, it's important that we know what the spec's asking. So pause here and then write down the specification. Now this next slide is got really nothing to do with the specification at all, but I thought it might be quite interesting. Now I know you can't click on the link, so I've given you the web address there, and I'll also try and put that web address onto the class notebook for biological treatments on Teams. And it comes from the Science Historical Archives, and it's showing footage of how people used to be treated in mental institutions for mental disorders, for psychiatric disorders. And all I can say is, thank goodness, you know, science changes and develops over time, because our treatments today are much more humane than they used to be, but it is worth a watch. So let's start off with a few basic building blocks of knowledge just for you regarding the use of drug therapy. Drugs that are effective in treating schizophrenia are called antipsychotic drugs. Remember, when a person suffers from schizophrenia, they can either be in a permanent state of psychosis or they will go into states of psychosis. And this is where they lose touch with reality. So this drug is, well, antipsychotic drugs are drugs that are there to help minimize a person's states of psychosis. So perhaps alleviate some of them. Please note, this is not a cure using antipsychotic drugs. It's there to help a person maintain and perhaps be in control of their mental disorder. Now, antipsychotic medication helps with disordered function, life, and well-being. And what that means is, if the antipsychotic drug can help target and alleviate or bring back a balance of the neurochemical abnormality, then it's going to help reduce perhaps the number or the severity of their psychotic sessions or states, and therefore it's going to help them in life general and their well-being. Now, antipsychotic medications are not used on their own to treat schizophrenia. It's also used alongside psychological therapies. The psychological therapies are designed for the person to identify perhaps their triggers, the things that perhaps cause or enhance their symptoms, and also to help them have coping mechanisms so that when they are moving towards a state of psychosis, that they can perhaps have some strategies to help them cope better with them. Now, antipsychotic medications with regards to schizophrenia is about helping with the transmission of the neurochemical dopamine. So it's about helping to regulate that, and because we've seen, when we've looked at the dopamine hypothesis, high and low levels of dopamine can account for schizophrenia. So pause now, pull out the information that you need to add to your notes. When it comes to the biological therapies, we're looking at antipsychotic drugs, and we're looking at 2 main categories. we're looking at typical antipsychotics. Now, typical antipsychotics were developed round about the 1950s, and they were developed to help reduce the intensity of the symptoms, in particular that of positive symptoms. Now, I always like to look at the word typical. This is a specific drug to target something specific. So it's very typical in treating something. And with these atypical type of drugs, it is about trying to then bring about a balance in, for example, dopamine, in order for it to help alleviate the symptoms. Now, these have been around about since the 1950s, and they do come in tablet form, syrup form, or they can actually be used with an injection. And they can be administered daily for a person. And what they're there to do, they are antagonist type of drugs within the systems. And we learned about antagonist type of drugs. And they're there to help reduce the action of the neurotransmitter. So antipsychotic drugs, but please note, some of them are not always there to help reduce, but perhaps increase. But when we look at chlorhexidine, we're going to be looking at the idea that they're there to work at reducing the amount of dopamine. Whereas atypical drugs are developed after the typical drugs. And these actually started round about the 1970s, and even 1990s. We're still developing a lot of different drugs. And they clearly do have perhaps more success than our typical antipsychotics, because they typically target a range of neurotransmitters. And that's why it's atypical. They're not just typically targeting that one specific, like typical antipsychotic drugs are. Atypical drugs are targeting a collection. So in our case, dopamine and, for example, serotonin. So what I'd like you to do is just pause here and give me a nice, clear explanation of what we mean by typical and atypical antipsychotic drugs. Great, thank you for pausing. Now, I'm going to ask actually more than one quick question, but one question, but applies to three different things. We have an understanding typical, and we understand atypical drugs, what they do. Now, when we look at typical drugs, we're going to be looking at one specific drug, and atypical, we're going to be looking at two. Now, what I'd like you to do for each of these, give an explanation of what the drug is, what it's designed to do, how it can be taken, and things like that. Give me an overview of the purpose of these drugs in order to treat schizophrenia. Now, I broke it down so it can help you pronounce them. So clozapine or pine, clozapine, chlorpromazine, chlorpromazine, and risperidone. So these are our three drugs. One of them will link to typical and two atypical drugs. So what I'd like you to do is give me a nice overview of why these typical and atypical drugs are used to treat schizophrenia. So pause the video now. Now, great, thank you for pausing. When we look at chlorhexidine, we can clearly see that it's an antagonist type of drug, and it's there to reduce the action of the dopamine neurotransmitter. And it's about working on blocking the receptors on the synapses So that will reduce the action and the build up of dopamine, because then it will start to reduce the symptoms of hallucination. And this type of drug can become in tablet, syrup, or injection form. They'll have various doses that they will take between 400 to 800 milligrams of this dose that will be taken on a daily basis. Now, as well as having yeah, I need to finish my sentence, don't I? As well as having a designed outcome of reducing the dopamine, there are side effects of chlorhexamine when it comes to that of treating schizophrenia. It has side effects that makes a person very sedate. So it sedates them. You know, it reduces their interaction, their motivation. They become more tired. And this can be a problem. Bit of AO3 here, serious side effects. You know, if perhaps somebody is in a mental institution, you know, are they giving them this drug because it's fully beneficial for their schizophrenia, or are they giving it to them for their sedating properties? So it actually makes them much quieter and easier to handle within that situation. So a little bit of AO3, something there for you to ponder. Now, so let's quickly look at atypical drugs. We've got two of them. Clozapine, developed in the 1960s, and it was discovered to be more effective than your typical antipsychotic drug. And actually, it seemed to help schizophrenia when it failed to treat other mental disorders, other antipsychotic disorders, because atypical drugs aren't just designed for schizophrenia. They're designed to target psychotic episodes, which can be applicable to a lot of different mental disorders. So they actually found that it actually helps with the symptoms of schizophrenia. And here we can see it's taken on a daily basis, and it's between 300 to 450, so much a lower dose than that of chlorhexamine. I mean, not chlorhexamine. Chlorhexamine is a lower dose of chlorprozamine, so a much lower dose. So they're not taking as much drugs. And the nice thing about this, it binds to the dopamine receptors in the same way, but it also acts on the serotonin. So it also acts on that aspect of serotonin and glutamate receptors. And we know that serotonin is associated with mood, so it's going to help alleviate some of their mood symptoms. So therefore, it's going to have perhaps much more of a positive effect on the individual compared to that of typical drugs. Risperidone, again, more recently developed in the 1990s. So yeah, really from the 1960s all the way to the 1990s, these drugs have been developed. It can be taken tablet, syrup, and injection form. And if it's taken in injection form, it can last for about 2 weeks. Here we can see typical doses is between 4 to 8 milligram, maximum of 12. And risperidone is believed to bind as well to the dopamine and serotonin receptors. And it does seem to bind more to the dopamine receptors than clozapine. So therefore, it might be, again, another type of drug to help alleviate the dopamine and therefore reduce the psychotic episodes. So just to do a quick recap, just on two of them, atypical, we've got chlorpromazine. It's to combat positive symptoms because of the overactive dopamine system. It's to bind to the D2 receptors, and it binds to the D2 receptors to help reduce the hypersensitivity of them and then bring back about balance. And therefore, we know that it targets that one specific, so that's why it's typical, it targets that one specific neurotransmitter to help reduce the positive symptoms. Atypical, it's designed to target a collection of things, so it's not just typically designed for one aspect and not specifically designed for schizophrenia. It is known as the second generation antipsychotic type drugs. Our group of unrelated antipsychotic drugs to treat psychiatric conditions. So like I just said, they're not specifically targeted for one specific psychotic condition. Chlordiazepine, it binds to the dopamine receptors, so the D2 receptor, so blocking the amount of dopamine that can be taken on. Again, high levels of dopamine. And what it is, it's designed to help try and bring about, to reduce the sensitivity of the D2 receptors so that eventually a normal amount of dopamine will be excreted. Nice thing about this, it acts on serotonin and the glutamate symptoms as well. So therefore it's going to be targeting and helping alleviating mood of that person. So it's targeting a whole collection of different aspects. Now, here I'm going to get you a task that includes AO1 and AO3, but it's to work on your AO2. Now, I've already put it on the assessment section on Microsoft Teams for you to complete, but I'd like you to explain to you what I would like you to do. You're going to get yourself into a role play situation within your mind, and you are a mental health practitioner, and you need to explain to your patient who has schizophrenia about the drugs that you may prescribe. So you want them to become fully aware, because really we should, when someone is taking drugs for a mental condition, we need to make them aware of what they're for, how they're taken, and why they're taking them. Okay, I know there's going to be a bit of an ethical problem here, and that does link to AO3. If a person's in a state of psychosis and they've lost touch with reality, are they actually going to be able to give fully informed consent? We know that is an issue here, and that's AO3. You need to create a pamphlet. So I'd like you to do it on a Word document so that you can submit it on Teams, about outlining all or the two typical and atypical types of drugs that can be used to treat schizophrenia. And I'd like you to do it in a way that it's an information pamphlet. So this is where your AO2 comes in. You're writing it in a way to explain why this drug may be used, how this drug's going to be used. And that's what I'm saying in the next point. You need to make sure that they understand what the drugs are called, what they do in treating the symptoms, why they're taking, how long they may need to take it for, how effective is the treatment, the side effects, whether it's appropriate. Now, appropriateness, does it work? Doesn't it work? We need to bring in some evidence to support this, and perhaps the ethical issues. Again, we're also going to be taking in how much they're going to be taking of the drug itself. So you're going to give them a nice, fully informed pamphlet. And the reason why I'm doing this, because you've got to design this pamphlet because the person suffering from schizophrenia is a medical doctor, a general practitioner. And actually, he's asked and he wants the detail in detail so that he can make an informed choice whether he wants to go ahead with this treatment or not. So obviously our patient here is not in a state of psychosis all the time. So we've got to be able to give him all that information. So here you're pulling all this information, and you've got until next week, Thursday or Friday, depending on what day you've listened to this on, to be submitted to me via Teams so that I can have a read to make sure that you've pulled in all the appropriate AO1 with the relevant AO3 that goes along with it. Enjoy your working. Remember, if you've got any questions, just send me an email. Take care and work well.